Now, you've been retained in this matter to provide testimony regarding the use of force that occurred on May 25, 2020 in the matter of the death of George Floyd. Is that correct?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And having been retained, you charge a fee for your services?
For my time in review, yes.
All right. Now, what is your fee, your hourly rate?
$295 an hour in this case.
And you receive a different rate for trial days?
I have a 8-hour minimum on days I'm expected to testify, yes.
Okay. And to use uses of force, are you commonly called upon to review body-worn camera footage and other footage such as surveillance or bystander video?
Yes. In fact, one of my academic publications is specifically about body-worn cameras, and I've done a great deal of both research and teaching on using video footage, interpreting video footage, especially in use of force cases.
If you could please describe to the jury just I guess the depth of body-worn camera footage you were able to view in this case as compared to one in which you might have just a single recording.
Yeah, sure. It's pretty common for a use of force to only involve an officer or two, to involve very limited video, maybe only the video from that particular officer. And body-worn camera or any video footage is just one more piece of evidence that I, in conducting a review, have to examine and weigh and measure against other pieces of evidence. In this case, unlike the vast majority of cases that I've been involved in, there were a whole bunch of videos. So videos from different perspectives of the same event that can allow a much more robust understanding of what was going on. To put it very simply, one camera only captures what's available on that camera, so I don't see what's happening off camera. But when I have multiple videos from multiple perspectives, multiple angles, it allows me to get a much better sense of what's happening when and where.
So using some examples, you examined the Frazier video, is that right?
Yes.
And you were also able to view the Alicia Finari, the Speedway employee's video as well, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then at the same time view the Milestone video, the larger overview.
Yes, that's the poll camera video, I think on top or near the top of the Speedway.
And can you describe to the jury the different perspectives that you were able to see using each of those videos and how the viewing of one aided the understanding of the other?
Sure. So very simply, the Ms. Frazier's video was taken from the sidewalk near the squad, near the police vehicle. And you really don't see Officers Lane or King on that video. On the other hand, from the perspective across the street at the Speedway or the poll camera, you do see those officers. It's simply because the camera isn't obstructed by the police vehicle.
Now, did you, upon your review of all the videos, the documents that you discussed, complete a report memorializing your findings?
Yes, I did. My findings and opinions.
About how long was that report?
The report total, I believe, was close to 300 pages. That includes a rather lengthy appendix that lists out all of the materials that I reviewed. The body of the report itself, which has my summary of the relevant facts and my opinions, was, I think, about 112 pages, 110 pages if we take out the table of contents, maybe, over 100 pages.
All right. And did you rely on your training and your experience and academic experience to review the evidence in this case and reach your conclusions?
Yes.
And have you reached your opinions to a degree of reasonable professional certainty based on generally accepted standards in your field?
Yes, I have.
Now, before sharing those opinions, sir, I would like you to please explain what factors you review when you're evaluating uses of force.
Sure. So first, as sort of a threshold point, I have to know what I'm actually looking at, right? I have to know which uses of force I'm actually reviewing. For example, if an officer is involved in a shooting, The saying is the officer has to account for every bullet that they put downrange. That is, they count as separate uses of force. After I identify what the uses of force are, then I apply essentially a four-step analytical framework. First, I identify what the relevant facts and circumstances are as viewed through the lens of a reasonable officer on the scene. Then I assess the threat, if any, presented by the individual's actions. Then I assess the foreseeable effects of the officer's use of force. And then the fourth step is sort of putting all of that together and assessing whether, in light of the facts and circumstances, the foreseeable effects of the officer's use of force were justified and reasonable because they were proportional and appropriate in light of the threat presented by the individual's actions.
By what standard are you making this assessment?
So the ultimate analytical question, that step 4, is applying generally accepted police practices, what we might call a national or professional standard for the way we expect and the way policing expects officers to engage with individuals and use force.
And what are these national standards based on?
So a combination of things. They're certainly influenced by constitutional law, for example, by history and research in policing. Since the 1970s or so, there's been tactical research within policing that's helped inform what we would now consider generally accepted practices, a great deal of evidence and experience as well.
Are there constitutional standards as well?
Yes, constitutional law, especially the Fourth Amendment standard, is one of the factors that defines or certainly influences generally accepted practices.
Is another influence a particular department's policies and training?
An agency's policies or training might, and indeed I would hope they are, reflective of the generally accepted practices, but we can't define industry-wide generally accepted practices by looking at a particular agency's policies or training.
So the standard you're reviewing is that of reasonableness?
That's correct. Now, we might look at a large number of agencies and say, okay, if hundreds or many, many police agencies are doing this thing, then maybe that's a best practice or a generally accepted practice. But you can't just look at one agency and say, it's reasonable because this one agency said it was reasonable.
Right. When discussing the constitutional standards, you're familiar with the standards set forth in Graham versus Connor?
I am, yes.
And you have a demonstrative, I believe it's Exhibit 954. And if I could publish that, the Graham factors.
Okay. 954 is received for demonstrative purposes only.
Right, and can you just please tell the jury what it is you see here?
So this is a summary of what are referred to as the Graham factors. These are specific factors identified by the Supreme Court in the case Graham v. Connor that we use really in that second phase of analysis. The second step, remember, is assessing the threat presented by the individual's actions. And to understand Graham v. Connor, kind of have to understand what we mean by threat. First, when we're talking about the threat that an individual may present, it's not some abstract notion. It's not general threat or conceptual. It's specific threat of something, right? Someone who's running away may present a threat of escape or a threat of assaulting an officer or the like. And further, we can define threat. We know that threat exists when the individual has the physical ability and the opportunity and the inherent intention to cause whatever specific harm we're analyzing. So, for example, imagine someone who's just standing there with nothing in their hands. They don't have the physical ability to hit an officer with a tire iron. So there's no threat that an officer is going to be hit with a tire iron. There's just no physical ability there. On the other hand, imagine someone who has a tire iron but who's 50 feet away. They have the physical ability because they have a tire iron, but they don't have any opportunity. They're too far away in that moment to actually present a threat. And then we could imagine someone who has a tire iron and they're 2 or 3 feet away from an officer, but they're changing a tire at the time. They have the ability and the opportunity, but there's nothing about that interaction, as the officer is talking with them, that suggests they have the apparent intention to cause that particular threat. So when you put all of those 3 things together, ability, opportunity, and intention, that's how we identify threat. The
I'd like you to contrast that with risk.
Oh, sure. So threat, as I've defined it, can be contrasted with risk. Risk you can think of as a potential threat. That person with the tire iron who's 50 feet away, they don't present a threat. If they get close enough, they might have the opportunity now, or the apparent intention, to strike an officer with the tire iron, but they don't yet. So risk is something that officers can use tactics and communication to help address. The goal is to prevent risk from becoming threat, and really to prevent threat from becoming whatever that relevant harm is. But while threat can justify use of force, risk can't. An officer can't use force on someone who's holding a tire iron and 2 or 3 feet away while they're just changing a tire, because there's no apparent intention, there's no threat there. The officer can do something like back away, build distance so they aren't 2 or 3 feet away, or interpose the vehicle between themselves and the individual they're interacting with, or use communications. They could ask the individual to put the tire iron down, but they can't use force there because there's no threat.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
This is what you get for having a law professor testify.
And they're trying so hard to take notes, and the court reporter's trying to take things down, so I'm going to slow you down a little bit, if I may, Professor.
Sure, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Then in assessing other potential risk factors, would you agree that the relative size of a person is a risk factor?
It's certainly a relevant consideration, yes.
But is it in and of itself a threat?
No, certainly not. Someone who's physically large may have a greater physical ability to inflict harm if they assault an officer, but that their size can't establish opportunity and can't establish intention.
And how about a recent drug use? Is that a threat or a risk?
Again, it's a relevant consideration, but it does not in and of itself establish a threat. It doesn't establish physical ability by itself to do anything. It doesn't establish opportunity to do anything, nor does it establish apparent intention. So it's certainly a relevant consideration in the totality of the circumstances, but officers can't use force on someone just because they're on drugs.
Now, I'd like to talk about, or I'd like you to discuss the severity of the crime at issue. How is that relevant to the Graham analysis?
Sure. So as we're thinking about the concept of threat, the Graham factors really help us identify when there's a threat and how much of a threat. Severity of the crime can be best understood as a proxy for dangerousness. All other things being equal, an armed bank robber may be suspected to be more dangerous than someone who is cashing a worthless check, for example. So severity of the crime is really a proxy for evaluating how much risk someone might present, how dangerous are they.
And if we could go to the third factor then, the active resistance, whether they are actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. How is that relevant to your analysis?
So again, this is all part of that threat analysis, that second step in my framework. And this is getting at the behavior of the subject. So for example, someone who's attempting to evade arrest by flight is threatening the government's interest in apprehending that person. It's about identifying a threat of escape. Active resistance can be similar. It's a threat of someone frustrating the government's interest in taking them into custody, for example.
Are there different types of resistance?
Yes, absolutely.
What are the types, generally accepted definitions in policing as the different types of resistance?
Sure. So the concepts are certainly generally accepted, although some of the vocabulary differs from place to place. We might first identify someone who is compliant, who's doing what the officers want, no resistance at all, right? Then we might have someone who is passive or non-compliant. They're not doing what the officers want, but they're not doing anything against what the officers are telling them to do either. The classic example of passive resistance is someone who's just laying on the ground, refusing to get up when told. Then there's active resistance, which is typically defined as someone who is engaging their muscles in some way. Someone who's tensing up or someone who's running away is engaged in active resistance. The next level up, if we can say that, is active aggression. And this is where someone is not just engaging their muscles, they're engaging their muscles in a way that creates a threat of harm to the officers or someone else. And finally, the ultimate expression of active aggression is when a subject presents an imminent threat, again, as that term is defined, of death or serious bodily injury to officers or others.
Okay. If we could take that down, please. Now, I think we've gone through in a little more detail the first two steps of your four-step process. Talk about identifying facts that would have been apparent to a reasonable officer. You've discussed identifying threats. You also testify that you need to identify the foreseeable effects of the officer's actions. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. What I mean by the foreseeable effects of the officer's actions is essentially what is this use of force likely to do? Just as there's a spectrum of resistance from no resistance to a whole lot of resistance, right, threatening the life of an officer, there's also a spectrum of effects that we might expect from an officer's use of force. So, for example, some uses of force are relatively minor and unlikely to cause any more than temporary discomfort. Other uses of force are substantially likely to cause death or serious bodily injury, what we would refer to as deadly force. As you're analyzing use of force, it's very important to focus on the foreseeable effects of what the use of force involved, and not the actual effects, not what actually happened. And I can give you an easy example. If an officer shoots at someone, that's a use of deadly force because it's foreseeable that discharging a firearm at someone is going to cause death or serious bodily injury. And that's true even if the officer misses entirely, or if the bullet hits the person but causes a very superficial injury, let's say it just scrapes them. It's still a use of deadly force because of the foreseeable effects, not the actual effects. And that concept of foreseeable effect is what's foreseeable really at the time force is being used.
And Professor Soden, the fourth factor that you testified about, determining whether the officer's actions are appropriate, proportional, and reasonable. Can you please explain what you mean by appropriate, proportional, and reasonable?
Yes, so what we're talking about is sort of a balancing of harms here. This also pulls from Graham v. Connor and the Fourth Amendment standard, which talked about balancing the individual interest against the government interest. The idea is an officer cannot use more force than the situation justifies. That is, the foreseeable effects of the officer's use of force can't be disproportionate to the threat presented by the individual's actions.
And sir, did you take all of these factors into consideration in your performing your analysis in this case?
Absolutely, yes.
I ask if you assisted with the preparation of a demonstrative exhibit, demonstrative 953.
Yes, I did.
And would the use of that demonstrative exhibit assist you in explaining your analysis and testimony to the jury?
Yes, and especially how those factors apply.
Offer exhibit 953 for demonstrative purposes.
Any objection? 953 is received for demonstrative purposes only.
And before we publish that, first I'd like to publish what's been received as Exhibit 17 and ask you, sir, if you identified, in accordance with your process, what particular force you evaluated. So if you would publish Exhibit 17.
Yes, there are two components to the use of force here. The first is the defendant's knee or shin over Mr. Floyd's neck. The second is Mr. Floyd in that prone position while restrained, what I may refer to as prone restraint.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 953. One moment, Your Honor. Did you also look at a demonstrative exhibit, Exhibit 949, that showed the relative position of the defendant and the other officers on Mr. Floyd?
Yes, I did.
All right.
And again, here you can see the two components of the use of force, the knee across Mr. Floyd's neck, as well as him being in the prone or face-down position while restrained.
I'm offering Exhibit 949 for demonstrative purposes.
949 is received for demonstrative purposes only.
And using what you saw as Exhibit 17, which has been received substantively in 949, again, explain what particular force you are analyzing and over what period of time.
Yeah, so again, both the prior image, the photograph, and this this demonstrative show the knee, the defendant's knee across the back of Mr. Floyd's neck, and Mr. Floyd face down in that prone position while handcuffed. The use of force here, use of force is not always a flash in the pan event. Firing a bullet might be, but other uses of force, including the uses of force in this case, are sustained. So they start when Mr. Floyd is put into the prone position and when the knee goes across the neck, and the uses of force continue until the knee comes off the neck and Mr. Floyd is taken out of that prone position.
And you indicated that the use of force included the defendant's placement of the knee on the neck. The other knee, where did that appear to be placed?
Yes, variously on Mr. Floyd's upper arm, shoulder, or upper back. I would put that for purposes I imagine we will discuss as part of holding Mr. Floyd in the prone position while restrained.
What was your determination of the duration of this restraint period?
From the time Mr. Floyd was initially placed in the prone position, 9 minutes and approximately 29 seconds until the knee was taken off of his neck and he was taken out of that prone position.
And did you determine this period of time based on your review of using Officer King's body-worn camera footage starting at 20:19:14 and ending at 20:28:43?
Yes, that's correct.
And is it your testimony that, according to national standards, the use of force must be reasonable when it starts, and it must continue to be reasonable during the entire duration?
Sustained. Rephrase.
And, sir, can you make any comment about how long the particular use of force must be reasonable, as in the defined restraint period?
Yeah, so a use of force that is sustained over a period of time does have to be reasonable at the time force is initiated. That is when force is first used and throughout the duration that force is being used.
And I believe you testified that using and applying these national and constitutional standards is viewed through the eyes of what a reasonable police officer at the scene. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's part of the Graham v. Connor framework, as well as certainly has been adopted into generally accepted police practices.
So then, using your four-step analysis to identify relevant facts and circumstances that would have been apparent to a reasonable officer on the scene, would you please summarize for the jury, based on your review, what information would have been available to a reasonable police officer in the defendant's position prior to his arrival at the scene that day?
Yes. So the reasonable officer on the scene standard is an objective one. We don't just adopt an officer's idiosyncratic subjective perspective. We take the reasonable officer and put them into the actual officer's position and say, what would the reasonable officer have perceived, seen, heard, or believed? In this case, prior to the reasonable officer in the defendant's position arriving on scene, he would have been aware that there was a call, I believe, dispatched about counterfeiting, that the individual was described as possibly intoxicated. The individual later identified as Mr. Floyd was identified as possibly intoxicated, that 2 other officers had taken the call, had, I believe, taken someone into custody and called Code 4, identified that they had the scene under control and did not need additional resources.
Now what I'd like to do is turning to the demonstrative 953. Right? You can see the beginning of this use of force evaluation, and you have this divided into different sections. Up top you have threat factors, at the bottom you have foreseeable effects of force, you have the defendant and his conduct up top, activity of Mr. Floyd on the bottom. Is that right?
Yes, the threat factors are really the behaviors of Mr. Floyd and whether they presented any threat. And the foreseeable effects of force are really about the effects of the use of force on Mr. Floyd. Yes.
Now, what I'd like to do at this time is show you a first clip. This is taken from what has been received into evidence as Exhibit 45, beginning at timestamp 20:17:40. And you see on the demonstrative here, it says defendant arrives on the scene. I'd like to publish that clip first.
Adjust the chair.
Okay, bro. You can't win, bro. You can't win. I'm not trying to win. Go on, get in the car then. Go on, get in the car.
He know it. He know it too, Mr. Officer. Y'all hear me? Don't do me like that, man. Please. Okay, can I talk to you, please?
So you get in this car, we can talk.
I am claustrophobic.
I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me.
God, I'm claustrophobic.
Get in the car.
Can you get me in the front? Please.
No, you're not in the front.
I'm claustrophobic, Mr. Officer.
Get in the car. We're going to pull you in.
Okay. I'm not a bad guy, man.
Get in the car.
I'm not a bad guy.
You ain't going to win.
All right. Now, sir, this is taken from the perspective of the defendant's body-worn camera. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
What information would have been apparent to a reasonable officer based on the exchange we just observed?
So a reasonable officer in the defendant's position would have realized that Mr. Floyd was in handcuffs, would have realized that there were 2 MPD officers already on scene, along with 2 more now, the defendant and the officer that he arrived with, would have realized that there was what we might call a point of conflict between the officers and Mr. Floyd, who did not want to get into the back of the car. One of the things that signifies is generally that, generally that the individual has been searched. Typically, an officer is not going to load someone into a squad into the back of a car until after they've been searched. As I said, a reasonable officer would have seen that this appears to be a point of conflict, would have heard that Mr. Floyd was describing himself as claustrophobic, would have understood Mr. Floyd to be offering some alternatives, right? Laying on the ground or sitting up in the front of the car, as opposed to being put in the back of the car. In other words, the point of contention does not appear to be police custody, right? Mr. Floyd does not appear to be objecting to being kept in police custody, but instead to be objecting to being put in the back of a vehicle.
Now, you're aware that the officers attempted to place him in the back of the vehicle, and he was eventually taken back out of the back of the vehicle and into the street. Is that right?
Yes, there was some non-compliance initially, and then what we would describe as that active resistance, what appears to be physical engagement of the muscles in a non-assaultive or non-aggressive way. leading ultimately to officers' decision to take him out of the rear passenger side of the vehicle.
And so, in your view, a reasonable officer would not have perceived this as active resistance, as an act of violence, or active aggression, I should say.
That's correct. This does not appear to be active aggression in the sense that Mr. Floyd does not appear to have the intention to assault or attack the officers here. His efforts appeared aimed at not being in the backseat of the car.
Now, I'd like to publish the second clip, clip 2, which is taken from Exhibit 43, which is Officer King's body-worn camera. And the footage begins at timestamp 20:19:01, and it's labeled Floyd placed prone. If you'd please publish that.
What? Please, man. I can't fucking breathe.
Here, come on out.
Look at you. Thank you. Thank you.
Get up on the ground.
Pause. All right. So we're paused here at mark 20:19:08. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, at this point, can you please describe what would have been apparent to a reasonable officer at the scene?
So, as you heard, Mr. Floyd has already said, I can't breathe, and as officers pull him out of the backseat of the car, again, that point of contention from earlier, you hear Mr. Floyd say, thank you.
And he is also appears to be handcuffed, is that right?
He is handcuffed, and I believe, although not entirely clear from this freeze frame, I believe the video will show that he's on his knees at this point.
If you'd resume playing clip, please.
Yeah, on the ground. On the ground.
Ah, my wrist.
You got your restraint. Hobble. Okay. I'll grab that.
All right. Now, from that segment that we just watched, clip 2, can you please describe what information would have been available to a reasonable officer in the defendant's position at that time?
Yes. So again, focusing on the threat analysis here in this step, Mr. Floyd remains handcuffed. He's put from his position on his knees, where he's said, "Thank you, and I appreciate that." Having been taken out of the backseat of the car, he's originally pushed over onto his left side, sort of facing the car, and then rolled from his left side into the prone position, into that face-down position.
Now, prior to having him, I guess, first brought down to the ground, at the time he was placed on his knees, I believe you indicated that he said, "I appreciate that," or "thank you," something to that effect?
Yes.
All right. At that point, was it necessary for the officers to prone him?
No.
Why,
It was not.
Why not?
Again, looking at the threat analysis here, it's clear from the number of officers and Mr. Floyd's position, the fact that he's handcuffed and has been searched, he doesn't present a threat of harm. His actions don't indicate that he presents any threat of escape. And as he's saying thank you for being taken out of the backseat of the car, it would certainly suggest that the point of conflict that had provoked his resistance in the first place is over. It suggests a lack of intention. Given the range of other alternatives available to the officers, it's just not appropriate to prone someone who is at that point cooperative.
What is the purpose of placing someone in the prone position in accordance with generally accepted police standards?
Yes, the prone position is a very useful position in policing for getting control of someone for purposes of handcuffing them. Again, the prone position is just basically face down, right? Their chest, front of the hips, on the ground. When officers are struggling with someone, or when they're handcuffing someone who they anticipate struggling with, you'll often see officers put someone into that prone position for purposes of handcuffing, because it's very difficult for someone to fight or to resist as they're face down on the ground, especially once their arms are out at their sides. However, the prone position, as useful as it is for handcuffing, is supposed to be transitory. It's used for handcuffing, and then as soon as someone has been handcuffed, you take them out of that position for, I imagine, reasons that we'll discuss.
And the position that you take him out of and put him into, is that the side recovery position?
It is, yes.
If you could then, just recalling the clip we saw initially when Mr. Floyd was on his knees and he was brought to the ground, what position was he in initially?
So initially, as he's on his knees, when he's brought over onto his left side, that would be consistent with the recovery position, laying on his side with his legs either straight or bent.
And then from that, essentially what would be the side recovery position, he was actually brought into the prone position from the recovery position. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And at this point, or shortly after this point, the prone position, the prone restraint position begins. Is that right?
Yes. When he is put into that prone position, that's where I would say that the prone restraint begins. He is restrained and prone.
Now,
as well as the knee across the neck. These are really the two uses of force that I'm focusing on.
all right, and this is where you've indicated as the beginning of the restraint period. Is that right?
That's correct. That red line indicates where the prone restraint and the knee across the neck begins in that timeline.
Now, I need to ask you, at the time that he was placed prone, when this use of force was done, was Mr. Floyd a threat?
So again, threat is specific, but I don't see him presenting a threat of anything. He was not a threat of harm to the officers, even to the extent he had physical ability. He didn't have much in the way of opportunity to assault or harm the officers, and just as importantly, there's no specific and articulable facts that an officer, a reasonable officer in the defendant's position could use to conclude that he had the intention of causing physical harm to the officers or others. It's very clear that although he had legs, so I suppose he had the physical ability to run away, he does not have the opportunity to do so. And again, there's no facts from which we could assess any intention to escape, so no threat of escape. And really, in light of the situation, there's not even a credible threat of obstructing the investigation. With 4 officers in the immediate area and one more, I believe a park police officer, maybe half a block away across the street, there are ample resources on scene to maintain control and custody of Mr. Floyd. 2 officers can stand with him, and the other 2 can go about doing the what was ultimately a forgery investigation.
And if we could go to the next clip, please. Right, and that clip is taken from what's been received as Exhibit 49, which is the body-worn camera of Officer Tao. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And it starts at 20:21:31. If we could publish that, please.
Please, please let me stand. No, please, man, I can't breathe.
Can you please explain to the jury what you heard and saw in this clip that's relevant to your analysis?
Yes, so there are a couple of things. First, of course, you hear Mr. Floyd saying that he can't breathe. That will come up as we talk about the foreseeable effects of the use of force. You'll also hear the officers discussing and ultimately concluding that they aren't going to use the hobble restraint.
Did they discuss why they wouldn't use the hobble restraint?
You hear, yes, you hear one of the officers say because something like, if we use the hobble, a sergeant's going to have to come.
Now, can you please tell the jury what generally how a hobble restraint system works and what it's for?
Yes, a hobble is used to limit the motion of someone's legs. So if they're kicking or flailing around with their legs, especially someone who's in, for example, the back seat of a police car who may be kicking out the windows or something like that, and essentially the hobble goes around the ankles and binds the ankles together, and then is connected to a belt piece, sort of a component around the midsection to slightly bend the individual's legs. Historically, the legs used to be bent up behind someone. Think of laying on your stomach and then kicking your feet up towards your butt. The way hobbles are generally used now is the feet aren't behind the individual, they're just brought up, so the knees are kept in front of the body and brought up a little bit. Again, the point is just to make it much more difficult, if not impossible, for the individual to kick.
And what would a reasonable police officer on the scene use to determine whether a hobble restraint is appropriate?
So hobbles are generally appropriate when officers cannot effectively restrain someone using only handcuffs. When they have someone who is continuing to kick or flail or flop around uncontrollably.
Is the absence or presence or the need to summon a supervisor an appropriate reason to either use or not use a hobble?
No, if the situation justifies a hobble, then officers should use the hobble, regardless of the fact that that means a supervisor will have to respond. If the situation does not justify a hobble, then they shouldn't use a hobble, regardless of the requirement to summon a supervisor.
And would you agree that a hobble is just sort of a brand name for a form of MRT or maximal restraint technique?
Yeah, so hobble, 4-point restraint, maximal restraint, there are specific brands like the RIP hobble, but yeah, these are all essentially the same concept that we're talking about.
And was the application of force by the officers without the hobble essentially a maximal restraint technique, but without the use of that tool?
To the extent that the hobble would effectively immobilize someone and keep them from kicking, then what you see here is officers controlling Mr. Floyd's upper body, middle body, and lower body, which would keep him from kicking. So although not a perfect parallel, I would certainly describe it as a behavioral analog of a maximal restraint or a hobble-like technique.
And when an individual is placed in the maximal restraint, the hobble, are they supposed to be placed in the side recovery position?
Absolutely. Just like handcuffing, as soon as an individual is restrained, handcuffs or hobble, you get the person off of their stomach, out of the prone restraint and into a side recovery position.
And I'd like to then move to the next segment.
If I may, on
we can move to the next segment here. We're looking at the next clip, which is Exhibit 47, beginning at 20:23:47. If you would publish that, please.
Roll on the side.
All right, and you please, and you can move forward on the next. Please explain to the jury what you heard that was relevant to your analysis in that exchange.
So there's one officer who's suggesting or asking about whether they should roll Mr. Floyd onto his side, and you hear the defendant say, no, he's staying put, and they're going to keep him in the prone restraint.
Okay. And what was the significance of that?
It would indicate to a reasonable officer that at least one person there did not feel that Mr. Floyd presented the level of threat that required them to keep him in that prone restraint position, that at least one person was suggesting we can flip him onto his side, or should we flip him onto his side.
Okay. And if you could proceed to the next clip. And again, if you could play that segment, Exhibit 47 at 20:25:38.
Roll on the side.
And move forward. And again, we heard a similar exchange. Is that right?
Yes, we did, along with one of the bystanders in the background saying he's not responsive right now. Both of those are factors to consider in identifying the threat that Mr. Floyd presented. If he's not responsive, obviously he can't present any threat, and the fact that you have an officer suggesting roll him onto his side, again, suggests the perception that officers are fully capable of maintaining custody and control of Mr. Floyd without keeping him in that prone restraint position.
Now, in accordance with your four-step process, the next step is to identify foreseeable effects of the officer's actions. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You did that in this case. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'd like you to please discuss, if you could advance the slide here. Okay. Right, go ahead. We have some potential foreseeable effects. What does a reasonable officer have to take into account when determining what the potential foreseeable effects of their actions are?
Sure. So under that first step of the analysis, we look at the facts and circumstances as they would have been aware to a reasonable officer on the scene. And some of those facts and circumstances may indicate that there are specific foreseeable effects of force. So in this case, again, we have those two separate components of force that I'm going to address. One is the knee across the neck. That foreseeably can cause pretty significant serious bodily injury or death. If you think of someone who's laying face down, where the head or face is against the ground and the chest is against the ground, that means the neck is kind of like a suspension bridge, right? So it's generally accepted in policing that you do not put weight down on someone's neck in that position because of the potential that the neck won't be able to handle that weight, and you can end up damaging the structures of the neck. That's kind of generic. There's nothing specific that we need in this case. That applies to all defendants, so I apologize, all individuals. There are also foreseeable effects of keeping someone in that prone position. Prominently, what's called positional asphyxia, someone who starts having trouble breathing, who can't take in over time the amount of oxygen that they need to sustain their life functions. This is something that's been very well known in policing for at least going on 30 years. The prone restraint position limits the ability of someone to breathe. And there are some additional specific factors relevant to this case that increase the susceptibility of Mr. Floyd to positional asphyxia, and that a reasonable officer would have known prior to the use of force. Specifically...
Ask another question.
And those additional risk factors, would those include the downward pressure of the weight of
Overruled.
weight of the officers?
Yes, absolutely. Additional weight on a subject's back can further compromise their breathing, rendering them more susceptible to positional asphyxia. The
Yep.
There's no question.
apologies, Your Honor.
All right, at this time, I'm going to ask that the next clip, clip 6, which is taken from Exhibit 49, which is, I believe, Tao's body-worn camera, and it starts at a timestamp 20:21:50. If you would play that, please.
What do you want?
I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my neck. I can't breathe shit.
Bro, get in the car, man.
I will.
Get up, get in the car.
I can't move.
I just wiped the whole
Ah!
Get up, get in the car.
Mama,
Get up.
mama, I can't.
Y'all
Up here.
opportunity to get in, bro.
All right.
You can't win.
My knee,
You
my
can't
neck.
win, man.
And can you please explain, are we looking at a break? Were you signaling to me, Judge, that we...
The next 10 minutes when a good break is.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Your Honor. With respect to this portion that we just viewed, what did you see that was relevant to your analysis with respect to potential foreseeable consequences of the officer's actions?
So two things really stand out. One is you hear Mr. Floyd saying that he can't breathe, and one of the indicators of susceptibility to positional asphyxia is that someone starts having difficulty breathing. The other The other component, one of the factors that can increase the susceptibility to positional asphyxia, is drug or alcohol intoxication. Even before the defendant arrived on scene, the counterfeiting suspect, who was later identified as Mr. Floyd, was described as possibly intoxicated. And here in this clip, you can hear the officers discussing the likelihood that he's intoxicated, that he was found with drug paraphernalia on him, and that they suspect there might be other drugs in play.
And there are other things that an officer can listen to, even including a report of distress from the person themselves. Is that right? Person upon whom force is being applied.
Absolutely. If someone is describing that they are experiencing medical distress, then officers have to take that into account as they're evaluating the continued effects of keeping someone in this case, a prone restraint position.
I'd like to play clip 7, which is taken from Exhibit 43, King's body-worn camera at 20/22/18. If we publish.
I'm through. I'm through. I'm claustrophobic. My stomach hurts. My neck hurts. Everything hurts. Get some water or something. Please. Please. I can't breathe, officer.
Hey, do a lot of talking, a lot of
They
yelling.
gonna kill me. They gonna kill me, man.
Takes a heck of a lot of oxygen to
Come on, man.
Now, during what we just viewed as clip 7, was the defendant, was the use of force the same as when you began analyzing this at point 0?
Yes, the officers are maintaining Mr. Floyd in that prone restraint position, but there are some additional indicators that the foreseeable effects of force are occurring, that he's experiencing positional asphyxia.
And did you hear Mr. Floyd say plainly that he was experiencing some form of medical distress?
Not only does he indicate it with the words he's using, saying that he can't breathe, but even compared to that prior clip, his voice is slower and thicker. So both what he is saying and how he is saying it would indicate an increased medical distress.
And would a reasonable officer on the scene then, hearing this, have at least been aware of the complaint?
Absolutely, especially when you hear an officer respond to that complaint, it's certainly an indication that an officer was aware of it.
Okay. And you reviewed these body-worn cameras on numerous occasions, is that right?
Yes, many times.
And did you have an opportunity to review body-worn camera in which the defendant's voice could be heard at the same time that you could see him as the speaker?
I believe there is, yes, he is identifiable as the speaker. I forget which body-worn camera that is, or maybe it's the comparison of multiple body-worn cameras, but he is identifiable as the speaker there.
And I'm sorry, and in the exchange we just heard, was he identifiable as the speaker who was saying, uh-huh?
Yes.
If we could go to clip 8, just taken from Exhibit 47 at 20/24/40.
Yeah, I think he was passing out.
And if you could advance, can you please explain to the jury what you heard and saw in that clip that's relevant to your analysis as to the foreseeable effects of force?
So the first thing you hear is one of the bystanders say he's passed out or something like that, and that's echoed by one of the officers who says he's passing out. As we're assessing, as we're assessing threat, if we can jump back to that for a second, someone who's passing out obviously does not present a threat. You don't hear Mr. Floyd, which is notable because until he stopped speaking, his vocalizations were kind of incessant, right? There weren't very many periods where he wasn't speaking until he wasn't. And you hear I'm sorry, back to the officer. You hear an officer saying he's passing out. That again indicates an increasing level now of medical distress.
And the officer who was stating this was in close proximity to the defendant at the time he was saying it, is that right?
He was. I believe this is Officer Lane, who is at Mr. Floyd's feet. So maybe of the officers who are on Mr. Floyd, maybe in the worst position to identify exactly what Mr. Floyd is going through, but still identifying that he's passing out.
In the clip that we just viewed at 20:24:40, that was approximately 40 seconds after a time that you've identified that Mr. Floyd had said, "I can't breathe," approximately 27 times. Is that the incessant speech you were talking about?
Yes. Before he fell silent, Mr. Floyd said, "I can't breathe," by my count, at least 27 times.
Okay. Now, if we can advance to the next clip. And I guess before we publish the next clip, which was from Exhibit 43 at 20:25:40, you made a notation here on the demonstrative exhibit regarding Mr. Floyd's movement and his speech. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So from approximately 4 minutes and 45 seconds after the prone restraint had begun, for the next 53 seconds, Mr. Floyd is silent. He's not saying anything, but he's still moving slightly.
And would this have been readily apparent to a reasonable officer at the defendant's vantage point at that particular moment?
Absolutely.
If we could publish the next clip.
Right now, he's not responsive right now, bro. No, bro, look at him. He's not responsive right now, bro. Bro, are you serious? He's going to with that other neck, bro. Is he breathing right now? Check his pulse. Check his pulse. Check his pulse, Tom. Tom, check his pulse.
Suspect is sitting on 20 to 30 years old. The victim is crying, and the suspect has a gun. He's pointed the gun at
What is that? What do you think that is? So you call when he's doing okay? You call when he's doing okay?
And what did you see in that clip that was relevant to your foreseeable effective force analysis?
So here the audio starts with the bystanders saying that Mr. Floyd is unresponsive, pleading with officers to check his pulse. Officer Chauvin does so, spends 6 or 7 seconds checking. It's two locations, or maybe trying to get the pulse in the same location twice before ultimately announcing that he could find the pulse. At that point, the defendant says, and Officer Chauvin clarifies and says, I'm just trying to find a pulse.
Bring up to the threat factors that if we're looking at the same event as Mr. Floyd presented, anybody a threat at this point? I'd like to advance to clip 11. And if you're published, please. Please tell the jury what you saw relevant to your analysis with respect to foreseeable effects.
So you hear Officer Lane describe Mr. Floyd as responsive. This is as the paramedics are arriving, and Officer Lane is directing the saying that Mr. Floyd is not responsive. Again, back up to the threat factor, certainly not a threat if he's not responsive. And now even more indication that the use of force is having deleterious effects on Mr. Floyd's health.
And if we can advance to the next clip. At that point, and I don't believe that's yes, actually go ahead and publish that. It's the Fraser video 20:28:42, Exhibit 15. What is it you see here that was relevant to your analysis?
This is immediately before Mr. Floyd is rolled onto the stretcher, and you see the defendant take his knee off of Mr. Floyd, and shortly after that particular clip, Mr. Floyd is rolled and lifted on the stretcher.
And so would that then mark the end of the restraint period that 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
Yes, it would.
Your Honor, this would be an opportune time for a break.
Let's take a 20-minute break.
tell him we're here. Full unit. I'm here. You hear me?
Yes, sir. Mr. Social.
Thank you, sir. During this restraint period that you've defined from second 0 to 9:29, did George Floyd present a threat of escape during this encounter?
No, the media staging area is
He
MLK.
presented a threat to physical property.
No, you're
No.
going to
Did he present
the media
a threat to
staging
the
area is
physical
MLK
safety of the
That's where
officers?
everybody, all the media is at MLK Park. That's where
Did he
you're asked
present
to
any
go.
sort of threat?
That's your staging area. The media is asked to go to that location.
Your analysis, you noticed that there were a number of bystanders in the
Yes.
Did your analysis include an assessment of the impact bystanders would have had on the situation?
Yes.
I said that was my nephew that got killed in the back of the
Fourth
school.
step
That's
of
why
my
I know standing framing.
analytical framework.
Like I said, the
The
administration shut down.
facts and circumstances include the bystanders and their interactions.
Okay.
All right.
It's just
And at this time, I'd like to play clip 12,
they saying that it was a kid.
which is Exhibit 49, starting at timestamp 20:22:22. How many bystanders did you observe at that particular moment in time?
A handful. There are 5 visible on the screen. At one point, it looks like someone a little further to the left of the screen, maybe walking across the street.
And this is another example of a clip that we've previously seen, is that right? Just taken from the body-worn camera of Officer Tao, who was oriented toward the bystanders.
Yeah, so the video clip that's sort of directly below, the 2022-18 clip, we heard Mr. Floyd saying the same things. That was when I was describing his voice getting slower and thicker. In the end of that clip, and near the end of this clip that we just watched, you will hear one of the bystanders make a statement about the officers being on Mr. Floyd's neck. That is the first time in this interaction, more than 3.5 minutes since the use of force began, that any bystanders are criticizing what the officers are doing. The only prior comments from one of the bystanders are encouraging Mr. Floyd to comply with the officers.
And so prior to this point, just describing the noise level, the volume of the bystanders and the noises at the time that George Floyd is expressing some medical distress to the defendant.
As you can hear, the bystanders are pretty quiet. You hear Mr. McMillan's, I believe, in his voice near the end of the clip. But other than that, it doesn't sound like anything more than normal road traffic.
If you could please then advance to clip 13. And this is from Exhibit 15, which is the Frazier bystander video at 20:23:11. If you would publish that, please.
We're being held down. They'll kill me.
Do you want me to ask if you want people?
This is why you don't do drugs, kids.
What did you hear in that clip that was relevant to your analysis of other facts and circumstances as related to the bystanders?
So your Officer Tao say something like, "This is why you don't do drugs, kids," to the crowd. You can see when he makes that comment, he's standing sort of parallel or maybe next to the officers.
Hi. Hey.
That's relevant because
Yeah,
if
we
you
are
concerned
at our home, which is
about
private property
crowd,
across the school.
if you are worried about interference from bystanders, you don't say things that are likely to exacerbate that situation with the crowd. And a comment like, "This is why you don't do drugs, kids," is not.
Yeah, it was just up the street a
thing.
little further. That was where they had us back to. You want us to be down there?
I'm gonna sustain as cumulative.
Okay. All right. Let me talk to Brian. I'll give you a call right back.
Noise level of the crowd.
They want us to go down.
Yes, it did later.
Apparently,
later
where
in
the
incident.
ambulances and stuff was, where I was.
And at this point, I'd like to
So.
play clip 14, which is from Exhibit 15, yeah, 2029
Allison just said she sees the other
You
shots
can
and
see
what she wants.
before we play it from the timeline.
She wants us to get somewhere
this
we can get up,
occurs
stay live. We
after,
don't have any problem.
The ambulance had arrived and the restraint stands. Is that right? We need to be with the other stations.
She wants us to be able to go somewhere, stay live. That way, we don't have anybody coming up and.
on the gurney.
I don't know. I'm just doing it.
If you would publish that last clip, please. And if you could take that down. And again, that happened after the restraint period was over. Is that right? The paramedics had arrived.
Yes, it did. And as we discussed, as you're evaluating use of force, you look at the facts and circumstances as they existed at the time, which means you can't consider events that occurred later, after the use of force is concluded, to justify earlier use of force.
In your analysis, did the bystanders present a threat during the restraint period?
No, they did not present a threat to the officers.
And it's judged by a reasonable officer on the scene of the defendant's position. Would a reasonable officer perceive as a threat?
No, the facts and circumstances. How far down do they want us to go?
It's not that far. You can see the.
For example, Officer
yeah.
Tao did not interpose himself between the bystanders and the other officers until maybe 6 minutes into the restraint
I
period.
did a phone at the top floor.
His communications with the crowd were, as discussed, when individual bystanders stepped into the street and were directed back up onto the curb, with one exception, they did so within a few seconds without any type of physical contact. When there was physical contact between Officer Tao and one of the bystanders who looked like an older child or a young boy, that bystander was swiftly grabbed and pulled away by another one of the bystanders.
Now, did you see the defendant interact in or with or in the area of any of the bystanders after the restraint period was over?
After the restraint period was over, yes, the defendant left the position where he had been during the restraint and walked back, I believe, to the squad, the police vehicle, walking by several of the bystanders, not really interacting with them, but just walking by them or near them. And then once in his vehicle, he interacted with, I believe, the same bystander we discussed earlier, Charlie.
And do you recall, in reviewing this matter, reviewing a statement that the defendant made to Charles McMillan, explaining his use of force upon
We could have done one 2 minutes ago.
Yes, I do.
We can do one whenever you guys want.
What the defendant's explanation for his force level was?
So this, of course, will not be an exact quotation, but it was something akin to describing Mr. Floyd as a pretty big guy, possibly under the influence or on drugs, and that officers needed to keep control over him.
And what is your assessment of this explanation? Does it justify the level of force based on the defendant's explanation to Mr. McMillan? Mr.
You hit from over here, and you had it.
All of those individual statements are true. Mr. Floyd was a large individual, and there was, as we've discussed, ample reason to suggest to a reasonable officer that he may be impaired by alcohol or drugs. But officers in this situation, reasonable officers will perceive in this situation, that they can maintain control of him without putting him on his neck or keeping him in that prone position.
Is there a national recognized standard for police officers with respect to the duty to render aid and preserve life?
Yes, it has long and rather loudly been said that the sanctity of human life is the highest priority in policing. That's absolutely generally accepted in policing.
And what does that include? What does that mean in practice?
It has a couple of different implications, one of which regard to the use of force itself, the second of which is the duty to assist or render aid to the extent that the officer has the ability and equipment to do so when individuals are in medical distress.
What if the officer doesn't believe the person who's reporting to be in medical distress?
Officers are not paramedics, they're not EMTs, they're not medical diagnosticians, they're not doctors. The person may be lying, but officers have a duty to respond to the situation as it appears. They cannot take for granted, just because some people lie to the police about medical distress, that everyone they're interacting with, or that any one particular person they're interacting with, is lying about being in medical distress. They have to take that seriously.
And what facts and circumstances does a reasonable officer take into account when determining whether or not they should render their aid?
Hey, how's it going?
A whole range of factors, what someone is saying, how they are saying it, observations by other people. In this case, in the clips, you hear bystanders identifying that Mr. Floyd is not responsive, for example, or may not be breathing. So whether the reasonable officer is really paying close attention to Mr.
Yes,
Floyd,
I can hear you.
the reasonable officer is really paying closer attention to the crowd.
Okay.
The point is the same. The evidence is suggesting that there is medical distress here. Of course, you also look
Mic
at the
check, 1, 2,
individual's
3, 4,
behavior.
5, 6,
So
7, 8.
in this case,
Mic check, 1,
you
2,
can
3, 4, 5,
not
6,
only
7, 8.
hear Mr. Floyd saying that he can't breathe,
Well, I don't want to,
but you
just
hear
in
the
case I
change
accidentally
in
open
his
it up.
voice, as we discussed.
Yeah, mic check. Mic
You,
check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
hear
8.
him stop talking, you see him stop moving, and the reasonable officer here would have been aware that at one point he no longer had a pulse. All of those individually are indicators of medical distress.
30 away.
As you look at them comprehensively in order, it's signs of increasing medical distress.
Then, Professor, I'd like to go to the last stage of your four-part analysis, and that is to determine whether officers' actions are appropriate, proportional, and reasonable. And I'd like you to now please share with the jury what conclusions that you have reached regarding the use of force by the defendant on Mr. Floyd. So, to ask you first, you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether the type of force used by the defendant on George Floyd on May 25, 2020 constituted deadly force.
I do, yes.
What is that opinion?
Yeah,
That it
Elizabeth,
did.
things
The
have calmed
use of
down
force
somewhat.
had the
That building
foreseeable
now
effect
secure,
and
as you just
substantial
heard
likelihood
from
of resulting
Superintendent
in
Bob
death or
Thomas.
great bodily
Now, this
harm.
community has been affected
Do you have
hard
opinion
by
to a
gun
reasonable
violence in the
degree
past
of
several months.
professional
4
certainty as to
Austin
whether
East
the type
students
of force
have died
used by
from
the
gun
defendant
violence. Now, I'm
on
going to step out of the
George
way
Floyd on
and
May
show you
25,
exactly what's going on.
2020
We
was
do want to point out a
reasonable as viewed by a
reunification site
reasonable
has been
police
established
officer on
at the
scene.
baseball field
I do have
behind
such an
Austin
opinion,
East
yes.
School.
What is that
That's
opinion?
near Wilson and
Both
South Hembry
the
Street. Now,
across
as
Mr.
you can see
Floyd's neck
behind us,
and
everyone, the
prone
entire
restraint
area is
were
secured with
unreasonable,
crime scene
excessive,
tape.
and
Officers have
contrary to
made their
generally
way out
accepted
of the
police
school.
practices.
We have seen
When, in your
several
opinion, did
crews
the
of
unreasonable force
paramedics come
begin?
out of the school.
When Mr. Floyd
As of
was
right
initially
now, we
put
are
into
not
the
sure
prone restraint
exactly how
position,
many
and when the
victims
defendant's knee,
there are. We do
was
know
placed
that
onto his
multiple
neck.
people have
And
been
when
shot,
did it end?
including a KPD
When
officer.
the
No
defendant's
word yet
knee was
on
lifted off of
the
Mr. Floyd and he was
condition
taken
of
out of the
those
prone
victims
restraint
or that
position.
KPD
Do you
officer.
have an
Now, we
opinion to
were
a
in
degree
front
of
of the school
reasonable
just a few
professional
minutes
certainty
ago.
as to whether under
We have had
defendant's
to
use of
since
force
move down the
whereby he
street as they
restrained
start to
Mr.
really
Floyd
process
in
this
that prone
area
position
around
for
us.
9 minutes
Now,
and
as we
29
learn more,
seconds
we will
on May
continue
25,
to follow
2020
updates. Again,
was
parents, if you
reasonable
need
as
to come
viewed
pick up
by
your
a
kids,
reasonable
you're going
police
to
officer on the
Wilson
scene.
and South
Yes.
Hembry Street.
What
That's
is
the
that
baseball field behind Austin
reasonable
East
officer
Magnet
would
High
have
School.
believed
Again,
that
Wilson
was
and
an
South Hembry,
appropriate,
the baseball
acceptable,
field.
or
That's where
reasonable
you
use
can
of
come
force.
pick up your kids. Any
And
students
was
who
the
were not
force,
involved
did the
will be
force-
back there. KPD
was the
has
force
all of the
unreasonable as it
surrounding
started
streets
and
for
as
the
it
most
ended?
part
the
blocked
time it
off
was
at
initiated
this
and
hour,
throughout
so
its duration,
please
yes.
keep your distance
And
around
finally,
this
do you have a
area.
degree
Guys, I'm going to
of
send it back to you in the
opinions to a
studio
degree
as
of
I
reasonable
work to
professional certainty
learn
as to
more
whether the
information about
defendant
that shooting that
appropriately,
does have multiple people
rendered
injured,
medical
including a
aid to
KPD
Mr.
officer.
George Floyd
We'll
on
keep
May
you updated.
25,
In Knoxville, Austin
2020,
Martin,
in accordance with
WATE 6 on
generally
your
accepted
side.
police practices.
I do, yes.
And what is that opinion?
The failure to render aid to Mr. Floyd, both by taking him out of the prone position and by rendering aid as his increasing medical distress became obvious, was unreasonable and contrary to generally accepted police practices.
Thank you very much, Professor Stoll. I have no further questions.
Mr. Mills.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a moment, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
Mr. Stoughton.
Are you talking about
correct?
the previous shooting? Is that what
Okay,
you're saying?
right, so
Yes.
get personal.
Yes.
So, Mr. Stoughton, you testified that
Okay.
you were a police officer for approximately 5 years before going into the more academic nature
All right.
of your work.
Yes.
I was full-time with the police department
I'm
for
gathering
less
all my
than 5
information
years
now.
and stayed on as a reservist for
All right.
another 6 months and was an investigator before
All right.
ultimately going to law school and taking academic degrees.
Okay. And you analyzed this case principally from an academic standpoint, correct?
I do not describe it as academic. No, I would describe it as the professional standards for policing.
And the Graham versus Connor standard that you've discussed, I mean, there's more to it than just those 3 factors, agreed?
The Graham v. Connor standard is the Fourth Amendment standard, yes. There's more to Graham v. Connor, and there's more to the professional standard than just Graham.
And that would include that the analysis of an officer's use of force is viewed from the totality of the circumstances, correct?
As viewed through the lens of a reasonable officer, yes.
So it's not just 14 10-second clips, it's the totality of the circumstances viewed through that lens, agreed?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the standards that Graham versus Connor establishes is that it shouldn't be viewed from the 2020 lens of hindsight, right?
The 2020 lens of hindsight is an admonition to not rely on evidence that was not available to officers at the time. It's part of the reasonable officer on the scene standard. It, of course, doesn't mean that we can't evaluate an officer's use of force after the fact.
Understood.
Hey, Molly, I got it.
But the information, what we look at is the
I got it.
information that was
Can you do me a
available to
favor?
the officer on scene at the time based on the reasonable officer standard, right?
And then my slide.
Not exactly. It's the information that was available to a reasonable officer at the time, not the information that the individual officer had.
Understood. So we look at it from a broader lens than just the officer that was actually on scene, right?
An objective lens, yes.
And that includes all of the things that would be known to a reasonable police officer on the scene.
Yes.
All right. So you started, you described your kind of 4-pronged approach to the analysis of this particular case. The same approach you take in every review you've done, correct?
Yes.
And ultimately, you focused the majority, as I understood, the majority of your testimony, or direct testimony, on the third and fourth prongs of that analysis. Would you agree with that?
No, I would describe most of my testimony as being about the second and third prongs, whether Mr. Floyd presented any threat, and if so, how much, and the risk factors to Mr. Floyd, the foreseeable effects of force.
Okay. I apologize. You're right, the second and third. The fourth being the generally accepted police practices, right?
Yes.
So let's start kind of from the beginning. One of the things that a reasonable police officer is entitled to do is rely on his or her training. Agree?
In part, an officer is not entitled under that professional standard to rely on training that's unreasonable. So the training has to be consistent with generally accepted police practices.
The training is based upon generally accepted police practices. A reasonable officer is entitled to rely on his or her training. Agreed?
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by entitled to. I'm analyzing whether an officer's actions are consistent with those generally accepted police practices. So if the training is consistent and an officer's behavior is consistent, then yes, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by entitled.
When an officer approaches any use of force or any arrest, one of the things that a reasonable police officer takes into consideration is his or her training. And provided that training is based upon generally accepted police practices, they can rely on their training in assessing the risk, the threat, all of the things that we've discussed. Agreed?
I think you're asking two different questions. So one question is, what does an officer rely on? And the second is, how does that factor into the analysis of an officer's actions? And those are very different questions.
Okay. So let's answer them one by one.
Sure.
Starting with the first. How would you answer the first?
Yes, officers generally rely on their training. At least I certainly hope that's the case.
And that also factors into the analysis, correct?
No. I'm not assessing an officer and whether they satisfy their training standards. I'm looking at whether they satisfy generally accepted police practices. So for my purposes, it's irrelevant whether an officer is doing what they were trained to do or they're not trained to do, because I'm looking at the professional norms that we expect.
Fair enough. Okay. Now, when an officer, let's kind of look at those second and third prongs step by step a little bit again. You testified that when a reasonable officer is allowed to take into consideration what information they would have received before the use of force began. Agreed?
Yes.
And in this particular case, you understand that Officer Chauvin was initially dispatched to this offense, correct?
Yes.
That dispatch was subsequently canceled, correct?
Yes.
That a second set of officers responded or took over the call, so to speak, correct?
Yes.
And that Officer Chauvin, without the other officers on the scene, was dispatched in an emergent state. Agreed?
Explain the last part, I'm sorry.
The officers on the scene did not request backup. A dispatcher made the determination that these officers needed assistance, correct?
Offhand, I don't remember exactly the justification for the response, but I would accept that if that's your representation.
And ultimately, so if an officer is canceled from a call, but then in an emergent situation, that's going to give a reasonable police officer a heightened sense of awareness as they respond to that call. Agreed?
It depends on what information is provided to the officer and the reason they're responding, whether they're responding at code 3, like some sirens or not. I would say it can, but I'm not aware of any facts and circumstances that would apply in this case.
So in this particular case, after Officers King and Lane initially responded to the call, dispatch sent Officer Chauvin and Officer Tao code 3 to the scene. You don't recall that?
I would have to review the material, but again, I'll accept your representation.
And ultimately, it was then because they were taking somebody out of the car, correct? Implying that a reasonable officer would know that someone was being removed from the car for some reason, right?
Yes.
And an officer would have that, a reasonable officer, who can take what they would know before the use of force into consideration, would know that fact.
Yes, a reasonable officer would have known that at some point prior, officers removed Mr. Floyd from the vehicle.
And one of the factors that you discussed in terms of the Graham v. Connor standard was the severity of the crime they were responding to, right?
Yes.
And ultimately, in terms of that, do reasonable police officers frequently encounter a situation that starts out as a mild offense, but elevates to something more serious?
It's certainly possible. I don't think there's any reason to suggest that there are facts or circumstances of that here.
If the officers who were initially on scene were struggling with an individual, resulting in dispatch stepping up 2 additional officers code 3, that would at least imply that there was something more serious than just a counterfeit, correct?
No, not necessarily. In this case, they were taking Mr. Floyd out of the vehicle for the counterfeiting.
Resulting in a dispatcher stepping up the call to code 3.
Yes.
And so, again, reasonable police officers, in addition to relying on their training, provided it meets professional standards, they also can rely on their experience, right?
The same caveats, yes. Yes.
Provided that those prior experiences meet professional standards.
Again, there's a difference between what an officer is relying on and whether their behavior meets the generally accepted police practices.
And so one of those types of issues that a police officer may have experienced is perhaps people don't like to be arrested, right?
That is not uncommon.
And that people who are being arrested sometimes feign illness or feign some medical emergency in order to avoid being arrested. Agreed?
So officers would know that when they get someone medical attention and it turns out the qualified medical provider can say there's nothing here.
Or that the person's behaviors change, right? They say, I'm having a heart attack, but then their behaviors are inconsistent with their words. They start doing jumping jacks or something.
I've never seen that.
So it's also, again, based on an officer's experience. It would be reasonable police officers may experience one suspect in a car disrupting the police intervention to assist other people in the car from avoiding apprehension. You see that?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
There would be, again, based on a reasonable police officer standards, or reasonable police officer's experience, that one person who's being detained by police may obstruct that police intervention to sort of protect or hide information about his or her passengers.
That the individual who's being
about to wrap.
detained may
resist or obstruct in order to prevent his or her friends from being searched or identified.
I suppose at least in theory that's possible. In this case, it's not fair that a reasonable officer being in the defendant's position would have been aware that there were passengers.
Did you said you spent 120 to 130 hours working with body cameras, correct?
Yes, something like that.
And you are aware where Officer Chauvin, and you're aware of where Officer Chauvin and Officer Powell parked their vehicle, right?
Yes.
And they were aware, based on the materials, that an additional squad car was there from the Minneapolis parking, correct?
Eric's trying to wrap
And
her.
that officer, where they were parked, was essentially across the street from each other at the point that Officer Chauvin arrived.
There were several cars out on the street. What I'm saying is I'm not sure what a reasonable officer in Mr. Chauvin's position would have
doing a
known
question and answer
about events
with
that
Elizabeth.
occurred on scene prior to his arrival.
He would know that other officers also responded, correct?
Yes.
Based on the dispatch, we know that Squad 830 from the Minneapolis Park Police arrived.
Yes.
And when he arrived, he would be able to look across the street, see that park police officer engaged with and doing whatever he's doing.
Hey, Brian, grab him.
Presumably, if you looked across the street and saw that, I don't know what the officer was doing at the time, but
An officer has to be attuned to his or her circumstances and surroundings. Agreed?
yes.
A reasonable police
Yes,
officer
we're out
has to
continuing
have a
coverage right now in
particular
front of Austin
situational
East High School.
awareness.
Now, we just got
right?
word from KPD
Yeah,
just a
I-
few minutes ago
yes,
that
I
the
wouldn't say a
TBI
particular,
is
I
en
would say
route from
a
Johnson
general
City at this
situational
time.
awareness,
They
absolutely.
should have
And
more
so
information about
when
the shooting.
Officer
Again,
Chauvin
multiple
arrived,
victims
if
have
he
been
parked
reported
directly
here in
across the
Knoxville.
street
We are at
from another
Austin
squad
East
car
Magnet High School, including
and
a
was aware
KPD
based on
officer.
dispatch
Now,
that
if you are a
another
parent
squad
and
car
you are
was in
wishing to
fact
pick up your
present,
child right now,
a
which we
reasonable
are
officer
seeing a
would
lot
be
of parents
generally
do,
aware of what
it is the
all
baseball
officers
field.
are
We're
doing,
talking
right?
Wilson Street
No,
and South Hembry
the-
Drive. You can see this area
A
is
reasonable
completely
officer who
closed
arrives
off.
without
All of the
more
surrounding
specific
streets, that's
information, would
Hembry,
not know whether that
all the way
police
down
officer is
Martin
talking
Luther
to
King
other
Jr.
witnesses
Boulevard.
about the
Now,
counterfeiting
multiple
call,
crews
or
are on the
other
scene. Right
suspects,
here, we're seeing
or,
Knoxville Police. We're
passengers in
seeing
the vehicle that Mr.
KFD.
Floyd was
Some crews
taken out
have
of.
begun to leave the scene, which may
Just
offer
seeing
a
an
sign of
officer
hope
interact with someone does not provide
as
nearly
to
enough
the
context to
condition of
understand
some of
all
those
the
victims. We are
context
not
of that
sure
interaction.
again
And
about
so,
those victims' conditions at this time, including that
reasonable
KPD
officer would never
officer.
take
Now,
into
here in just a few
consideration
minutes,
that
we
that
should
other
hear more
officer,
from TBI
even if
as
it
they
were
arrive on
another
scene and
citizen,
begin
in terms of,
processing,
again, the
which
use
is
of
generally
force,
a
that
normal
other
thing
officer
for TBI
becomes
to do when it
unavailable
is
to
officer
assist him
involved.
based
Now,
on
you
what
may
he or she's
remember
doing.
we have been covering this for several months. Officers having to respond to
The
shootings
officer
around the school. We're talking Stanley Freeman Jr. and
I'm sorry, can you ask that again, please?
Janaria Muhammad, who
reasonable
were
police
shot
officer
just
arrives on
around this
scene,
area.
right?
This community
Looks to his
still
left and he sees
healing
an
from
officer
those
talking to two
shootings
citizens.
involving so
Looks
many
to
young
his
people
right,
at this
and he
high
sees
school.
two
Now, you may
officers
remember
struggling
Knoxville
with
Mayor
an
India Kincannon,
individual
School
or
Superintendent
having a
Bob Thomas,
point of
all
contention, I
offering
believe you called it,
more
with an
more
individual,
hope,
right?
more
At the point where he
resources,
arrived, I wouldn't
more
call him struggling, but
security
yes.
here at Austin
But he
East to prevent
observes
these
that
kinds of
there's
things from
obviously
happening.
something
Now, we
that's a
still do
little
not
bit
know
more
yet
serious
what
going on here,
exactly
right?
unfolded here today. We do know one
yes, at least
officer
they have
was
one
shot.
individual in
Multiple
custody
victims
that are in
have been
handcuffs,
reported
yes.
as
And
we speak.
the
Again,
reasonable
TBI
police
is
officer
expected to
would
be on
know that
scene
that
in
other
just a few
officer
minutes.
who's
Of course,
all the
we'll
way
bring you
across
more
the street
as we learn it
is not
in
going to be
Knoxville.
as
Austin
much of
Martin,
an
WATE
assistance
6 on your
as
side.
he could potentially be as he's approaching the
Yes, if I understand your question, yes. As the officer arrives there, he is in a better position to offer immediate assistance to the officers interacting with the handcuffed individual than
No,
an
something's wrong with the
officer who
switcher.
is talking to whomever.
a reasonable police officer will assess a person's words in the context of their actions. Agreed?
I would say assess both their words and their actions, yes.
And if someone is saying, I'm going to cooperate, I'm going to cooperate, I'm going to cooperate, that's what they're saying, their words are saying, but their actions are not cooperative, right? What is an officer to do in that situation? Just automatically believe that they're going to sometime cooperate?
I think it depends on the situation. No, I don't think an officer has to assume that this person will, at some future point, comply.
And in fact, an officer, again, is entitled to use force under these national standards greater than the force or greater than to overcome the suspect's actions, right?
So I really don't like greater. Sometimes I hear that formulation, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If someone is running away, what is force greater than running away?
Okay.
I would say that an officer has to use or can use force that is proportional and reasonable to address an individual's non-compliance or resistance, assuming, of course, that they have the authority to do so.
Right. And how it is frequently described in these materials that we've reviewed is that an officer can use more an amount of force
This community, your nephew Stanley Freeman,
that is greater
talking a little bit
than
about the past few months and
greater
lawsuits
than
and
the force being
what
used by the
this community's going
suspect
through
in
right
an
now.
effort to overcome
I just feel that this community is going through
Are
enough
you asking
pain,
me about the
and,
MPD training materials
we
specifically?
suffered.
Yes.
This community has suffered enough, and that I feel that we need more intervention by our school officials. The kids cannot solve this themselves. We need grown-ups. We need city officials to intervene to make some changes, like metal detectors or whatever it takes. But you just can't say stop the violence and they're going to go away. You got to intervene.
So what do you think the community could do? What do you think KPD could do more?
Well, I mean, I think the KPD, you know, has done pretty much what they could do.
A reasonable
Still gonna
officer
have to have, intervention, like I said, like a metal
should
detector.
be
You're gonna
permitted
have
to rely
not
on
depend on the
information
kids
that
to
they
solve these
receive
problems.
from his or her
And
partner officer,
adults gonna have
correct?
to solve this.
Yes.
And law
And do
enforcement.
you recall in
kids cannot do
reviewing the
this.
video
And that's what the system is
after
dependent
as
on.
this
They're dependent on the kids.
struggle was ensuing,
I think that
Officer Chauvin
these kids
asking
that do
if
these
he
type
was
of
under
shoes and stuff,
arrest?
They got to be tried as an
I
adult.
do. I believe
You know,
that's
my nephew was
either
killed.
prior to or
and
as
if you
they're
don't
taking
try
him out of
these
the vehicle.
people as an
Out of the
adult,
police vehicle.
And other
you know,
officers
it's
confirmed
not
that he
going
was
to change
under arrest at
everything,
that
but
time,
it'll
correct?
make a difference.
Yes,
But,
either
like I
Officer
said,
King or Officer Lane
my
says,
family
well,
went
he's
through a lot
under
of
arrest
pain,
for forgery
and,
or again something very similar.
He was just
And
going to school. He was an innocent
Mr.
kid.
Floyd
And
said
again today,
forgery for what?
innocent
Right?
people get hurt.
Yeah,
So,
something like that.
We'll see what happens.
And
What
so,
would be your
in the
message to
context
any
of this
family
particular case,
involved, you know, today,
does
or you know,
a
you and your
reasonable
family have
police
gone
officer
through the hardest
decide
thing a
if
family
the
can go
person,
through?
if the
What
suspect
is
should
your
be put
message
into
to
the
anyone
squad
else?
car,
My
or does
message,
the suspect
to the
decide
family
whether they should
is
be put
that,
into the spot?
you know, you just got to grieve first.
Does the-
But it's going to come
I mean,
a
the
time that you got to
officer
stand up for
determines
what
that
happened.
someone
And
should be put
none of
into
this,
the squad,
none
again,
of this
assuming
should have
that's-
happened this way. We don't
there's
know. We
legal
don't know
authority in the line.
if
And
it
so,
would have happened any other way or
assuming
something.
that
You know,
there's
but we
legal
know it should have
authority,
happened this way. It
the
should happen at
suspect does
school.
not get to
So it should be
dictate, do I
something,
get to sit on the
something
ground or do I
done
have to sit in the squad
make sure
car?
that this
Agreed?
is not happening.
To some extent, yes, absolutely. There's a
Hermione, do you have a
yes.
Now, as we watch through the clips that you selected, the clips that we watched were not chronological necessarily in order, right?
Going in sort of top row and bottom row, each was chronological. The first clip happened first, the last clip happened last, and then we went back to the beginning on the bottom part, the foreseeable effects discussion.
Reasonable officer would also presumably have some knowledge about his partner's.
You might define some knowledge, but they would certainly know some stuff about the other officers that they were interacting with in close proximity. Yes.
A reasonable officer may know that these other officers who are on scene on their second or third day as police officers.
They can't get the guns off the street. You know, just tell these kids to stop this and stop that. You got to have some intervention. It's not going to happen by just talking.
If those are facts and
So,
circumstances
I mean, their intervention
they are aware of,
have to be, of course, they got to be at home also.
yes.
But what I'm saying
It's
is,
entirely possible for an officer to not to work with an officer in the field that they don't know
they
that they
should be
don't know
able to know what's going on the street.
Now, you testified on direct examination that a reasonable officer when they approached and saw what was happening with Mr. Floyd would know that, for example, that person had been searched,
Somebody's
right?
filming. This whole community
I believe I said that it would certainly suggest that someone
Stanley
has been
Pittsburgh,
searched
all
because
every kid over
don't generally load someone into a vehicle before they have been searched.
But you don't know if the search was, that reasonable officer would not necessarily know if the search was thorough, correct? Because they didn't see it.
As you pointed out, officers are allowed to rely on the information that they get from other officers. So while the officer is not in a position to gauge how thorough the particular search was, there is an element of relying on other officers to do the job they were trained for.
And also in terms of, we don't know whether the vehicle that the person and or his occupants was in was searched. A reasonable officer wouldn't necessarily know that.
Yes, that's correct. Without additional information, I don't know why a reasonable officer would know that a vehicle had or had not been searched, or had or did not have occupants.
But in fact, during the course of their interaction with Mr. Floyd, the officers did in fact discuss that Park police was over with the occupants of the vehicle and that the vehicle hadn't been searched, right?
At which point?
As they had Mr. Floyd restrained.
I can't tell you exactly
At the tower,
when
several
that
roads
happened.
are still
I remember
closed here
some
in front
discussion
of
to that
Austin
effect.
East High School and surrounding area.
So officers,
We've talked to
you would
family
agree they
members
go
of
through this
Stanley
process
Freeman
of
Jr.,
reassessment
who
of reasonable
was
police
lost to
officers,
gun violence
right?
here just a few
certainly
months
hope so,
ago.
yes.
And
this,
officers will
he says
get
this is a deeper
information
issue and
that
more
may
needs to be
change
done to keep our
how to
school
deal
kids
with a
safe.
particular
Now, right
situation,
now, multiple
right?
agencies are on the scene of a shooting
that
here
may-
at Austin
yes,
East
as
High School.
officers get
Multiple
additional
gunshot
information,
victims
they
have
may update
been
their
reported at
response,
this time,
escalating or
including a
de-escalating
Knoxville
the use of
police
force, for
officer.
example,
Now,
or
right now,
talking
we
to
do
one
not
person, not
know the
talking to
condition
one person
of the
that they
officer
had originally
or
intended to
anyone
speak to. Sure.
inside that was hurt. We do know
Now,
in
in
the
terms
last
of,
few minutes,
again,
the TBI
the
is
concept
on the
of
way to the
situational
scene.
awareness,
They should be
an
here
officer
anytime.
has
They
to
are
be
coming from
around
Johnson City,
his,
so it may take just
aware
a
of his
few
or
minutes
her
for them to get
surroundings,
here.
right?
Now,
And-
as you can see, that
and
scene
that
is
would
very
include
active
things like,
still at this time.
being
However,
in a
crews have
busy
begun
street,
to
right?
pack their things and
yes,
start to
tactically,
leave as
that's why you
KPD
don't
begins the
want to
investigation process.
throw someone
Now,
out
of course, it will
on
probably
the
take
street when you
hours
have
to
the
find
option of
out
not doing
exactly
so.
what led up
In
to the
terms
shooting
of those
and the
tactics,
condition.
however,
Again, multiple
when
people
Mr.
have been
Floyd, so I
shot
want to
here
make
at
sure
Austin
that we're
East
very
High School.
clear here.
KPD
In
is
your
on the scene.
position,
Knoxville Fire
from your
is
review
helping
of
them
the
close off the
reasonableness of the
surrounding
use of force,
streets.
it
Now,
was
again, if
unreasonable
you
for the
are a
officers to
parent
put
and you need
Mr.
to pick
Floyd
up your
in the
child
prone
and you have
position
not done
at
so
all,
yet,
period.
those
Correct?
children are being held at
Yes.
South
At
Henry
that point,
and Wilson
he did
Street.
not
That's the
present a
baseball
threat
field.
to the
KPD has
officers
set up a
or
secure
their
area
interests.
for
He did
any
not
parent still
present
needing to
a
pick up their
threat of,
children.
escape.
Again, that is right behind
the
Austin
officers
East Magnet
used
High
some
School.
amount of force
Now,
to
if you
put
were
him
driving this way,
into the
Martin Luther
car,
King
and I have
Jr.
no
Avenue
issue with that.
is completely
But putting
shut
him in the
down
prone
at this
position,
hour.
especially
South
on the
Henry
street
Street
side of the
also
car,
closed.
was
The streets behind
unreasonable and
the
excessive and
area
contrary to
of
generally
Austin East
accepted
High
police
School,
practices.
the athletic fields are all still closed at this
Reasonable
hour.
minds
Coming
can
up in just a few
disagree.
minutes, we'll hear from
On this particular
several
point, no.
community members
So
about
Sergeant
today's
Steiger,
events
who
and how they
testified earlier,
unfolded
did you
and
have
what
an
we're learning
opportunity
so
to
far.
review his
I'll send it back to
testimony?
you guys in
I
the studio.
believe yes, I did.
And so his assessment that it was reasonable for the officers to use the prone position in that time, at that time, you would disagree with that.
I disagree. I think putting someone prone is unreasonable there. They are already handcuffed. The prone position is a transitory position used to restrain someone, handcuffs, or I suppose hobbles. In this case, officers took Mr. Floyd out of the car, put him on his knees, and then put him onto his side. And again, if they had stopped there, I would not have any problem with their actions.
Now, you testified that you described the prone position as transitory in nature.
It is, yes, for 30 years or so, it's been generally accepted that it is a transitory position for the purposes of handcuffing or securing.
Are there ever situations where officers would keep a person in the prone position longer than a transitory nature?
There shouldn't be. Putting someone in a recovery position is literally a matter of rotating them 90 degrees onto their side. Officers can maintain as much or almost as much control over the individual. So while I suppose it's hypothetically possible, you know, if there's, I don't know, if gunfire breaks out and officers are laying on someone to protect them with their body, maybe,
it is rolled on,
but certainly not in this case.
Hey.
So in you,
can you use the very
academic
last
endeavors, you submitted a opinion piece to the Washington Post. Do you recall that?
Specific to this case, I don't know, close to 30 guys.
On May 29th of 2020, an article appeared in the Washington Post, authored by Seth Stoughton, that's you, right?
Stoughton, but yes.
Sorry. Jeffrey Noble, that's the person you wrote the book with, right?
Yes, one of the two individuals.
And Jeffrey Elko, right?
The other co-author, yes.
And so, you wrote officers might need to hold someone down in the prone position, but they should do so by putting their shin across the subject's upper back, not the neck. You disagree with that?
Are you asking if I wrote that? I did, yes, referring to handcuffing.
Someone's neck risks damaging the cervical spine or breaking the hyoid bone, which can be fatal.
Yes.
And this was an opinion that you had formulated. Your opinion piece was from 4 days after this incident?
That Yes, it was based on the review, as I think I write in the first or second paragraph of the opinion, the limited information that was available at that time.
And so at that point, it's fair to say that you had already formed the opinion based on that limited information that this was an unreasonable use of force.
I think it's fair to say that I had formed the opinion that putting your knee across someone's neck, except in absolutely unbelievably rare circumstances, is generally inappropriate use of force. This is an application of that generally accepted practice. Of course, as I reviewed all of the materials in this case, some of the opinions that I discussed at the bottom of that op-ed changed, and this was not one of them. The additional information confirmed that the knee across the neck was inappropriate and that the criminal restraint was inappropriate.
Was the knee, in your opinion, across the neck throughout the entire 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
Yeah, Elizabeth, we are hearing that building is now
From
secure,
my
and
perspective,
people
that's
are
irrelevant.
being
The knee
released
should
that
never
were
be
not
on the neck.
involved. That means
It was
parents can pick
certainly
up their children
on the
at
neck
South
for
Hembury and
a
Wilson Street.
majority
That
of
is
the
the
time,
baseball
even if
field
it
here
was
at
moved
Austin
off of
East
the
High
neck
School.
at
That's
certain
according to
points.
Knox
Can
County
you-
School
were you
Superintendent
able
Bob
to
Thomas.
somehow
Now, the
determine
Bureau
the
of
amount of
Alcohol,
pressure
Tobacco,
that was
Firearms, and
applied to Mr.
Explosives,
Floyd's
or the ATF is responding to this
Not with any
as well as the
specificity,
Tennessee
of
Bureau
course.
of
There
Investigation,
are
which
some
is protocol when an
indicators
officer
that it
involved
was
shooting
a
happens.
substantial
Now,
amount of
what we
body
know
weight,
so far,
but I
the
can't
Knoxville
tell you
Police
exactly
Department
how many
reports that multiple
how many
people,
pounds.
including a KPD
For example, the
officer,
positioning
have been
of
shot following a shooting
the defendant's hips
at
forward
Austin East
and
Magnet
over
High School.
the
Now, that
left
happened
leg.
earlier this
The position of the
evening,
defendant's
just before
shoulders is
school
supposed to
release
be
time.
back in
KPD
sort of
reports
squat
this
position where you'd be
investigation
resting on your
does
feet.
remain
It was
active at
forward,
this time.
indicating
I'm going to
more
step
weight
out of the way
on
so
the
you can
front
get a
appears to
better
me.
look at the scene.
And at
Now, the
times
scene
it
has
was to the right,
somewhat
correct?
calmed down. We are seeing some crews begin
yeah,
to
I
pack
think
up.
his hips,
Knoxville Fire has
or
reduced
not
some
his hips,
of their
excuse me,
presence here.
his
You
right
can see
shoulder
this
dipped,
area still
at some
taped off.
point.
The area surrounding
I'm
Austin East High
unable
School,
to
that means
say
Martin
what
Luther
effect
King
that
Jr.
had on the
Avenue,
weight on
South
his
Hembury
left
Street,
knee.
Wilson
So let's
Street,
go back
except
to,
for that corner where
the
KPD has set up that secure pickup
period
area
of
for
time when
parents.
the officers
Is
were
closed at this
attempting to put
hour.
Mr.
Now,
Floyd
if you are
into
in
the
the
squad
East
car.
Knoxville area, you're going to want to avoid
Reasonable
this area
police
again.
officers,
Austin
again,
East
in
High
assessing
School.
their use of force, have
KPD
to take
is on
into
the scene. Multiple
consideration,
people have been shot,
the
including a
strength of the
Knoxville police
individual,
officer.
right?
The TBI should be
yeah,
here
sure.
Based
any
on the
moment now.
experience that
Of
they
course, we
may
will
just
continue
have
to
had,
bring you
right?
updates as we learn them. Now, we have been talking
how
to the
strong
community.
someone
We've talked to
is a
several
reflection
community
of
leaders,
their
as
physical
well as the
ability to
uncle
resist
of
in different
one
ways.
of
So
the
that is
victims
certainly a
who was
factor in
killed
that threat
in a shooting
analysis.
just a few
And
steps away
you
from
already
where
testified
today's shooting happened.
that
That's Stanley
the
Freeman Jr.
officers,
His
a
uncle
reasonable
says that
police
KPD
officer
has
can
done
take
a lot to
into
improve
account
security,
size
but there is
differences.
still
Agreed?
definitely work to be done.
Size
Now, coming up in just a
differences,
few minutes,
number
we'll
of
hear his
officers
words
versus number
exactly
of
and his
subjects,
advice
physical
for families
characteristics,
involved in today's shooting
age,
and
you know,
what this community can do to begin the healing
10-year-old versus
process.
a 40-year-old
Again,
may
in Knoxville,
present a
Austin Martin,
different threat
WATE
or
6 on
risk
your side.
analysis. Agreed?
Yes, they have different levels of physical ability, the threat that they present, or the severity of the threat they present, even in doing the same actions, right? A healthy college student and a morbidly obese 90-year-old are not going to throw the same punch.
Reasonable police officers do take into consideration an expected, perhaps, EMS response, right?
In what context?
Time.
I'm sorry, in making which decision, yes, absolutely reasonable police officers. I mean, when you call EMS, you expect EMS will respond. So certainly officers can act in reliance that EMS will respond when called.
And you understand that in this particular case, EMS was called.
Yes.
And that was contemporaneous to the point of the discussion about the use of the MRT, correct?
Yes, I forget if that's when they were initially called or when they were upgraded, but yes, somewhere in there.
Again, a reasonable police officer in assessing the physical condition of the suspect, it would be reasonable for him to increase the response of EMS based on those observations.
Can you tell me what the in and out is?
To upgrade it, to ask for a coil lights and siren response. Yes, absolutely. What's not reasonable is hold.
Responsive at that point.
Concluded at that point.
Okay, cool.
A reasonable officer has to take into consideration his or her position relevant to
42
other
seconds. Okay,
bystanders,
cool.
right?
Hey,
Meaning
can you
if
do me
I'm
a
on
favor?
my-
Can you
if a
tell the
police officer's
producers
on the
that-
knees and there is a crowd of
Yeah.
people that are
Can you
standing
tell-
above them, that's a consideration that a reasonable police officer would make.
Okay, can
Depending
you
on
tell the
the
producers
situation, that
when
can
when
affect
it
the
is getting
concept
ready to
that's
come to
referred
me to
as
stop,
reactionary
get,
gap.
like let go of the button so I can
It's
hear them?
one of
hear
many
the
such
answers,
factors
whatever
in,
question
this
they have for me.
totality of the circumstances.
Yes. All right, that's it.
So,
Cool. Bye.
if there is some reason to believe that the crowd is threatening in some way, yeah, absolutely. But I don't see that the case here.
Laura
You've
was holding
seen,
on.
obviously,
like when they're
the
queuing you
footage,
right
and
there?
at
Yeah,
one
Laura-
point you
Well,
observe
we're
Officer
kind of
Chauvin
live. I can't hear what Elizabeth's
reach for
asking, so I'm
his
just going in
mace,
cold.
correct?
Yes.
And shake it.
He takes it out of the holster, and I forget if he shakes it, but he definitely has it deployed, yes.
They
While
want you
saying
very soon.
to the crowd, don't come over here.
Or something like that, yes.
I have a feeling next star will be
Reasonable
calling.
police officer would know that they are being recorded, right, in this situation.
I mean, the officers are wearing body cameras, so they should know that they're being recorded.
And based upon your review, it appears that several people are standing right out in front of the officers holding what appear to be cell phones, correct?
Oh, yes.
And a reasonable police officer would be, who is situationally aware, would be aware that they are being recorded by the bystanders. Right?
I think that's a fair description,
Hey.
depending on the positioning of the officers. I'm not sure a reasonable officer, Officer Lane's position, or Mr. Floyd's feet would have been aware, but in the defendant's position, yes.
And you're
Yes.
familiar with the concept that sometimes situations may look awful, but they may be lawful.
Okay, I'm gonna do a whole
Concept?
setup and I'll just pause.
I suppose Can you explain what you mean there, please?
Sure. The police use of force is never a particularly attractive thing to watch or to witness.
It's not very pretty. Yeah, I think
Service
that's
is
often
going
the
in and
case.
out.
And just because it's not very pretty does not mean that it's not lawful use of force. Agreed?
Yes, sure. An officer can act reasonably and consistent with generally accepted police practices, and it can look bad. As I said, I don't think that's the case here.
Based on the standards that you're aware of, prone control
In just
of
the
a
last few
subject
minutes, we've
versus
seen
prone
more and more
handcuffing.
crews
Those
begin
two
to clear the
different,
scene. Now, this is as
police
KPD begins
practices.
processing that scene here at Austin
There is a
East Magnet High
significant
School.
difference
Now, what we know
between,
so far, multiple people have been
the
hurt. A
positioning and the
CPD
techniques of
officer
getting someone
also hurt
into
in that
handcuffs.
shooting. Now,
And
you may
then the,
remember we're only 5 months
techniques
in,
and tactics of
just 4
maintaining
months
control of someone once they've been
2021,
handcuffed.
and
So
already
if that's
at
what you're
least
asking,
3
yes, the
Austin East High School students
actions that
and
an officer
one
takes
just a
while
few weeks
handcuffing
before the
someone
beginning of the new
are not
year
necessarily
have been
justified
killed
after the individual
in
has been
gun
handcuffed.
violence. Now, you may remember
You're
16-year-old Stanley
aware of
Freeman
the general
was killed
concept
just
of a use
blocks
of force
away from where
continuum,
we stand
correct?
right now.
Oh, yes.
Earlier today,
And
I
that a
caught up
use of
with
force
his
continuum,
uncle, who is first on the
may
scene. Now, he
include
knows just
also what is
exactly
called
the pain, the
passive
fear that these
resistance.
families are going through.
Agreed?
This is what he had to say about
the
everyone
resistance
dealing with
portion
this.
of the use of force continuum can include what we can call passive resistance. Absolutely.
And passive resistance does not exclude the possibility of the use of force.
That's correct. So to go back to my previous example, if you had someone who is laying across a driveway, for example, protesting whatever happens on the other side of the driveway, the officer may use force to address that passive resistance to move that person. Sure. Again, there has to be a threat that they're addressing with that passive resistance.
So, in terms of at the point Mr. Floyd is placed prone on the ground, you observe,
Now, KPD and Knoxville city leaders
to,
have promised to do all
kick
they
his
can
back legs?
to improve security here.
Are you
and
talking
Bishop
about
did
as
tell
he-
me
as he
he
is brought
believes
down to the
things
ground?
have gotten
Yep,
better, but
initially.
we still have a long
So
way to go.
there's one
Now, this is a quote
movement
from
that's
earlier this
captured
year
on, I
from
believe,
School Superintendent Bob
Officer
Thomas. He
King's
says
and
we have
Officer
to do
Tao's
something about
body
this,
cameras,
and I'm hopeful as a
that
community
it
we
looks
can
to
come together.
me
All of the
as if
agencies need to
Officer
come together,
Lane is
and let's
grabbing
figure out
Mr.
a
Floyd's
solution
leg and
for
pulling it and
this. Now,
straightening
on
it and
behalf of the
rotating
Board of
it.
Education, I know our board is grieving as well, And our board stands ready to do,
that is my
as I said
interpretation of what
earlier,
is
anything
happening
and
there.
everything
And in
that
fact,
we
at that
can do to make
particular point,
to make sure a
Officer
situation
Wayne
like
says
this
something to the
doesn't
effect
happen
of,
again.
"Jesus Christ."
Unfortunately, just a few months later, we
I
are
don't
right
remember
back
if
in the
it's at
same
that
position.
particular
Again,
point.
multiple people
Yes,
have been shot
it's
here
not clear
at
to me what he's
Austin
referring
East
to. He
Magnet
later,
High School in
makes
East
some
Knoxville, including a
comments
KCD
about what appear
officer.
to be the
Now,
smell
right
of
now,
Mr.
we are
Floyd's
awaiting
feet, so I'm
TBI
not sure
to
what he's
get on
responding
the
to when he
scene
says
and
that.
give us an
So
update exactly what
you
they
did
know.
not observe
As you know,
him attempt
details
to
at this
control
time
Mr.
are still
Floyd's
limited.
legs
Now,
at
I'm going
that
to step out of the
particular
scene, out of
no,
the
he was
way of the
definitely
camera
controlling
just
Mr.
a
Floyd's
little
legs at
bit.
that point.
You can see that area still
When they
blocked
bring-
off at this
when the
time.
officers bring Mr. Floyd
KFD,
from
Knoxville
his
Fire,
knees
that
onto
is,
his
has
side,
began to reduce
and
some
then
of its presence. We are
from his
beginning
side
to
into
see
that prone
more
position,
school leaders
that
arrive on scene.
grabbing
Now, any
and
parent
what
who
I see
may
as,
not have picked up
pulling
their
the leg
child
is
at
part
this
of
time, they
controlling
have
the
been
leg to
released.
flip his
You will
Mr.
go to the
Floyd's hip
baseball
and put him into that prone
stadium
position.
here at Austin
At
East
which
Magnet High
point,
School. That is the
Officer
baseball field
Lane
at South
kneels
Hembry and
over and then
Wilson
later
Street.
holds Mr.
Now, of
Floyd's
course,
leg.
as we
So,
learn
yeah, he was
more
definitely
this
controlling
evening, we
his
will
legs.
continue to
Now,
bring you
you
live
would agree
updates
that a
here
reasonable
in
police
East
officer
Knoxville.
has
For
to
now,
assess
Austin Martin,
multiple
WATE
situations
6 on your
simultaneously.
side.
Agreed?
No, a reasonable officer has to assess the situation that they're in. Certainly, there are simultaneous inputs to that, but they're in the situation that they
Connor,
should be
what's up?
focused on.
So, a reasonable officer who's in a situation where they've just struggled with
Clifford
three
Bishop.
officers
He
have
is
just
the
struggled
uncle
with
of
an
Stanley
individual,
Freeman Jr.
they're going to have some sense of exhaustion themselves. Agreed?
Depending on the length of the
as far as I
struggle
know.
and their
I think
efforts
so.
in the struggle.
I think we've talked to him before.
In this case, it was relatively abbreviated.
They would have to take into
Hang on,
consideration
Justin's
the
calling.
changing circumstances throughout the use of force. Agreed?
Absolutely, they need to take into account changing circumstances.
And you were shown some footage of the crowd that was present or that formed initially. It was a relatively small crowd. Agreed?
Yes, I mean, personally, I wouldn't describe it as a crowd. It was like 12 to 15 people, including folks over by the bus stop. So a group of bystanders.
People across the street as well, right?
There was at least one person filming from across the street. I don't remember seeing many bystanders on the other bystanders' cameras.
Okay. You agree that the camera only captures what the lens captures, right?
Any individual camera? Yes, any individual camera will only capture what's on camera.
And so, for example, that city pole camera, the milestone camera, you can see other individuals standing, more than one individual standing on the sidewalk across the street from where the officers were positioned.
Yes, at times, yes.
And at various points, you would agree that there were people across the street to the southeast, excuse me.
Is that the Dragon Walk restaurant? Yes. Yes, I believe the park police officer remained over in that way, in that direction.
With you know to be two other passengers who were in the vehicle, at least, correct?
I do, yes.
And also know that, but they're standing there. So officers who are in the scene, a reasonable officer is assessing not just what's in front of him in terms of the subject, but they're assessing, does this group of people present a threat or a risk to me?
Yeah, that's the basics of situational awareness, right? Knowing, not getting so focused on one particular thing that you lose awareness of the broader situation, the context in which you're acting. Excuse me.
Yep, and again, a reasonable officer, in terms of situational awareness, will try to be aware of what's behind him.
Yes.
Or to his right or left.
The surrounding situations, yes.
And reasonable officers can be distracted by those types of things.
So depending on what those other stimuli are, yes. In this case, the first, again, more than 3.5 minutes, there's no criticism from any bystanders. There's either silent bystanders or, in the case of Mr. McMillan, bystanders who were urging Mr. Floyd to comply with the officers.
There was also radio traffic, right?
Some amount of radio traffic, yes.
Confirming at one point at least that EMS was en route, code 3.
Yes, that was, I think, relatively late in the interaction, but yes. Or confirming that they were at a particular location.
Because at the particular time, we watched a couple of seconds as they were discussing whether Mr. Floyd was using some sort of controlled substances. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
A reasonable officer has to take into consideration, as you testified, that the suspect may be under the influence of a controlled substance, right?
Absolutely.
And a reasonable officer, based on nationally accepted standards, you testified has a duty of care in that particular situation, right?
In the situation where someone is potentially under the influence of controlled substances?
Yes.
So my testimony was an officer certainly has a duty to render medical aid as appropriate. Just because someone might be on drugs doesn't necessarily create a medical situation, but it certainly affects their susceptibility to positional asphyxia, which officers should take into account.
And a reasonable police officer, in terms of his or her belief that someone may be under the influence of a controlled substance, can take into account that that person may be stronger than they would normally.
In terms of assessing the potential physical ability of the individual, yes, that of course doesn't play into the opportunity or the apparent intention prong of threat.
You would agree that reasonable police officers should have a higher level of awareness than non-law enforcement officers?
I think the nature of the job makes that a really good idea, yes.
When you take into account the reasonableness of the use of force, you would agree that you're not actually experiencing what the officers
Yeah, do you want me talking?
Right?
That I individually am not experiencing it? No, I am applying the reasonable officer on the scene framework. I'm not, in fact, there.
Right. And so you don't have the same sensory responses to what the suspect or the officers are doing. You would not know, for example, is this person tensing his or her muscles because you're not feeling or touching that person.
Yeah, so tactile feedback is one of the things that may not show up on video. It might, but it does not always show up on video. That's correct.
When you do your use of force
we're
analysis,
outside of Austin East Magnet High School, as you just see.
Dangerous environment.
As you just said, around 3:15 this afternoon, law
without
enforcement
making any
agencies
jokes about my
responded to
kids,
that
no,
officer
I'm
involved
not
shooting
generally doing
here
it
at the
in
school.
a-
I'm going to step out of the way so you can get a live
situation.
look at what we are seeing right now.
You have
Now,
the
you can
luxury
see
of
multiple
slow motion,
KPD units as well as Knoxville Fire
enhancements,
are on the
looking at
scene
things from
right now.
multiple
We're beginning to see
perspectives.
school
Agreed?
leaders emerge from that building. We still do not know the condition of most of those
So
involved.
for the
Now,
portion of the,
KPD says, based on the preliminary
inquiry where
investigation, Knoxville
excuse
police
me,
officers
for the
responded
portion
to
of the
Austin
inquiry where
East
I'm
the report
identifying
of a
what
male
the
subject who
underlying
was
facts
possibly
were,
armed in the school. Upon
yes,
approach of
I
the
can
suspect,
slow video down.
subject
I can freeze
shots
frame
were
it.
fired. A KPD officer was
As
struck
I
at
am
least one time and
taking
transported
those
to UT
facts
Medical
and
Center with
circumstances
injuries that
and
are not expected to
identifying
be
what a
life-threatening
reasonable
at
officer
this time.
would have perceived
One
in that
male
situation. I'm
who
of
was
course aware
pronounced
that a
deceased at the
reasonable
scene,
officer on the scene does not
while
have
another
those
was
capabilities.
detained for further investigation. There are no
Now,
other
you
known
also
gunshot
described
victims at this time. Now, that is according
seeing
to
what
KPD
you
at this time.
believe
We
to
are
be
awaiting
Mr.
the
Chauvin's
arrival of
knee on the neck of
TBI
Mr.
agents.
Floyd.
They are
And you
coming from
described that
Johnson
as
City
deadly
as
force.
we speak.
Agreed?
We expect
Yes.
them on scene here in just a few minutes, which
you're
is
trained
protocol
in
when an
prone
officer is
handcuffing
involved
and
in a
prone
shooting
control
like that.
yourself,
As we
correct?
learn more, we'll continue to follow. Hold on
yes,
just a
I
moment.
suppose.
I'm going to
And
step
in
out of the
terms
way.
of,
We are
an
starting to hear
officer's training
community
to use prone
leaders
control, as you
who are
described in the
angry
Washington
at the
Post
school.
article.
Now, this
The knee should be
for the
in
past
back
several months,
between
we've
the
covered
trapezius
several
muscles.
deadly
Agreed?
shootings in this
trapezius,
area.
shoulder blade,
Two of those
tricep
you may
area,
remember: Stanley
lat,
Freeman
the
Jr.,
big muscle over here.
Janaria Muhammad,
yes.
who were all
And that
killed.
would
Stanley
not be
Freeman Jr.
considered
just
the use of
killed
deadly
just
force.
blocks
Agreed?
away from this.
If
now, officers are
again,
on their
kept,
way down to where where we
transitory,
hear
so that we aren't
some
turning that
protesters
into a
of the
prolonged
violence
prone restraint,
begin to speak. We'll
then
continue
no, that would
following
not be
this and bring you
considered
any
deadly force.
updates from the scene as we learn them. Again,
Reasonable
multiple
police
people
officer
have been shot here at
based
Austin
on,
East Magnet High
national
School.
training
We'll continue to
standards,
follow the latest on air
would
and
take into
online and on
consideration the
Facebook Live
prospect
as we
that
speak. In Knoxville,
person
Austin
who
Martin, WATE 6 on your side.
fights with them and then appears to be compliant could potentially become a threat again.
What you're describing is risk, right? The idea that they could potentially become a threat, that's the very definition of risk. Yes, and officers can do a range of things to mitigate risk and to prevent it from becoming to prevent it from becoming a threat. They can't use force to address risk.
But they can use some degree of force to deal with passive resistance.
Yes, they can use some degree of force to address passive resistance. Passive resistance does not present, of course, a threat of escape or harm to the officers. And it's the type of situation where if someone is passively resisting while officers are just trying to maintain control over them, then you just hold them on their side.
And in terms of a person who's handcuffed, it's not a reasonable officer would never expect that person to get up and run away or become a threat.
That's not my testimony. My testimony is that there may be some risk of that, but officers can generally maintain control over a handcuffed individual in the side recovery position, which is what it's designed for.
You also watched one of the clips where one of the officers checked for a pulse, correct?
Yes.
And you heard Officer Chauvin say, pump?
Yes.
And then the response was, I'm just looking for a pulse?
It was something like that. I said I was checking for a pulse, or said I was looking for a pulse, or something like that.
At the point that the officer references, we didn't watch the entirety of it during this clip, but at the point the officer references that he was passing out, you also hear officers say that he's still breathing.
Yes. At that point, he was still breathing. Or at least the officers are narrating that he was still breathing.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Sir, you were asked some questions, and I'd like you to provide some further explanation regarding using more force than the subject presents. And I believe you were asked if the officer was allowed to use sort of a level up of force. Is that an oversimplification of the reasonableness standard?
Yes, it is, and it's an oversimplification that really doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like I said, what does it mean to use a level up from passive resistance or someone running away? You know, running faster doesn't count. So I don't find that to be a helpful formulation of explaining proportionality and reasonableness.
And you also testified as to the need for officers to reassess the situation in cross-examination. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Be situationally aware of changes in circumstances. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that some officer may need to be aware who's behind them across the street at some point. Is that right?
Sure. Officers should maintain that level of situational awareness.
But should a reasonable officer maintain a level of situational awareness as to what's going on right in front of them?
Absolutely. That's still the primary focus. Situational awareness is not exclusively focusing on what you're dealing with right in front of you, but it's also not ignoring what you're dealing with and that's right in front of you.
And with respect to tactile response, that's feeling the response of someone whom you're touching. Is that right?
That's correct. So someone who's, you can't just tell looking whether I'm pushing on my own hand. So yes, that's correct.
Would a reasonable officer in the place of the defendant then have the situational awareness to understand he's kneeling on top of a limp person who's not responsive?
I would certainly have hoped so.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
what
a
we
reasonable
did
officer
at
would
J.
absolutely
We
be
just
aware
dialed
of
each
that.
other in.
And in terms of situational awareness and relying on information provided from
like,
partner
if you hang up
officers,
the
when
call,
a reasonable
or if
officer in the defendant's situation had paid
messes up,
attention
then I have to
when
hang
the
up to
comment
call
that they
you
couldn't find
back
a
into
pulse
the
was
call.
made.
Yes, absolutely.
usually
That's
doesn't
an
happen. I'm just
incredibly
saying, like-
important piece of information for an officer there, as is the moving of the individual. One of the things that we know about positional asphyxia is this concept of vicious cycle, which is that as someone starts to have difficulty breathing, they move or resist, if you like, for breath. They're fighting to breathe, not fighting officers. And again, this goes back almost 30 years as generally accepted with regard to positional asphyxia. The main officer should address it.
In terms of rendering medical aid and the decision of an officer to believe someone who is stating something like, for example, I can't breathe, should the officer, using situational awareness, determine the credibility of that statement based on all the facts and circumstances presented at the time?
I was going to head in. Do you guys need
yes,
anything?
and again, the officer has very limited ability to engage in credibility determinations there. So if someone is expressing difficulty breathing, you roll them onto their side so it's easier for them to breathe. That is what the side recovery position was intended for.
One hypothetical situation is a person standing in a distance from me to you, speaking in the tone that I'm speaking, expressing to you that I can't breathe. You might have reason to doubt that based on all of the facts and circumstances, correct?
Sure. Under our under our interactions, there's no reason to believe that that's the case. There's no behavioral indications. We're continuing to have the same conversation. As the officer, I would still want to take that seriously and potentially some medical aid, but we're not in the position of me, knocking you down and doing CPR or anything.
But if you're kneeling on top of me and telling me that you can't breathe, that might be a different situation. In your situational awareness, I prompt you to believe that, in fact, what I'm saying is what I'm actually experiencing. What would the situation be? Well, I have no further questions.
Any further requests? Thank you, sir. You're excused.
Thank you.
I think I saw him actually flying around. Is he here or in the scene? I saw him flying around. I see his session.
This is the jury. We will be taking adjournment for the day, but I wanted to give you an idea of a little bit of time frame now that we're getting closer to the end. We expect that we will be moving to the defense case tomorrow. And accordingly, we expect that we will finish all the evidence in this case.
I know you were working on it. You were watching.
Possibly with even Friday off. My preference is not to make the attorneys close on Friday because when they close, this case will be submitted
so do you
for
want me to call
deliberation.
into TO2?
Which means at that time, as we
warned
warned you long ago in jury selection, you'll be sequestered. If I were to have closing arguments on Friday, that
I'll
would
have to hang
mean
up
you'd
and
be
then call
sequestered
in,
and
so
you'll
you
be
just tell me
condemned.
what you want to do.
And I don't know if you have any plans. I'm not going to do that. My preference is to give the attorneys more time
you
to
just tell me
prepare
when to
their
wrap
closing
or
arguments and have the closing arguments we predict.
Bob Thomas with the school district superintendent. Also Scott Erlin with KPD there as well, all huddling together just outside the door there of Austin East. We just want to pass along again, this was a comment that was made by Commissioner Penny Schwinn, releasing this a few moments ago, saying that it is time to wrap arms around the affected students, the educators, the entire community to support them through this horrific tragedy. Of course, news making its way to Nashville, getting reaction that we heard from the governor just a little while ago, also saying that he had been made aware of what was happening here in Knoxville and monitoring the situation here closely. We do want to talk more about what's going on at UT Medical Center. We want to check back in right now with our own reporter, Kristen Gallant. She is outside of UT Medical. Well, we'll check back with her here in just a little bit. We're still getting that ready for you right now. But earlier we heard from American Cannon saying that she had gone to UT Medical. That is where the KPD officer was transported to after the shooting. Non-life-threatening injuries. So again, that's the latest. We want to report on him. Let's see if I can pull that back up for you coming from KPD. some of the earlier statements, but they responded when there was a report of an individual that had a gun on campus. We've got some new video here just coming in. Let me show you this. This was posted to Facebook just a few moments ago. Apparently a student inside the school posted this. We reached out. They shared it with us. This video appears to